Welcome to the Remodeling Reimagined Podcast, the podcast that gives you an inside look at the remodeling industry from award-winning designers. On this week's pod, Bob Buchan sat down with attorney Bob Incollingo to discuss the common disputes that homeowners have with contractors. Without further ado, here is your host, Bob Buchan.
Hey, thanks for joining us today on another episode of Remodeling Reimagined. Joining us today is Robert Incollingo. He is an attorney with a law firm in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. He specializes in construction, business, and real estate law. He has a firm in New Jersey. So welcome to the episode, Robert. Thanks for being here.
Well, thanks for having me.
And do you prefer to be called Robert or Bob?
Bob is better.
Okay, same here. So never met a Bob I didn't like. So it's awesome that you're here. So thank you for being here. So I guess, people are, with how busy things are in the construction field these days, people are dying to get their homes remodeled. There's a lot of people out there looking for contractors, and I'm sure they're desperate to get them. So, there's a lot of things that people have to be concerned about and on the lookout for. So we're here today to talk with Bob about some of those things. And I guess really the first question I had for you, Bob, is just what are some of the common disputes that homeowners have with their remodeling contractors?
Well, I suppose the disputes are common across the board, but if I could just frame my answers to all your questions, they're going to be specific to New Jersey law. With an eye on what homeowners and contractors generally come to disagreement about, most of the times it's a difference in expectations about the work. The homeowners might allege that the work is not meeting their expectations, that it's substandard in some way. You also get disputes over delays and what's included and what's not included. Those are the sorts of things that people come into disagreement about.
So what would you say then would be an important thing to have to help to avoid disputes in the first place?
Well, anytime you've got risk in a business transaction, and a home improvement job is certainly a business transaction, even though you're dealing with a residence, you need a contract. And in our state, if the job is going to be worth more than $500, you have to have that contract in writing, and it's got to have all the bells and whistles that the home improvement practices regulations require. So contract is where it begins and ends. You need to have a good contract.
Awesome. Okay, good. Well, speaking of contract then, so what rights do homeowners have when they sign a home remodeling contract? What does that give them when they get that?
Well, what happens is that whether you sign the contract or not, you're going to come in, both you and your contractor, under the umbrella of a number of home improvement regulations and statutes. Consumer fraud law is heavily laced in and out of these kinds of regulations. There are rules about contractors being registered with the state of New Jersey for doing home improvement. There are rules about what a contract has to have in it, how the sale of a contract for home improvement must take place. There are rules and regulations about giving the consumer homeowner notice of certain rights they have to rescind the job within 3 days of signing the contract, and the details that they're entitled to as to what they're buying.
Awesome. Okay, great. Well, and you highlighted a couple things that should be included in a home remodeling contract. Are there anything else that's really stands out that really should be in there to protect the homeowner?
Well, there are things that should be in the contract, and there are things that are incorporated into the contract by law that people are most concerned about and tend to be evergreen problems, such as whether or not the workmanship meets the standard. In our state, any kind of a construction contract has implied into it a term that the work will meet the standard for workmanship in our area, or the area where the work is performed, so that if you don't get what you paid for, whether or not the letter of the contract is observed, you may find yourself going to court over whether or not that work rises to the level that it's required by law to meet.
Okay. And you had mentioned before something that should be in a contract. You had said that there should be, there's a 3-day right of rescission. What exactly is that?
Well, a right of rescission comes from the Latin word meaning to cut back. You can, with a right of rescission, cancel the contract and go back and unwind the deal if you do it within the time period allowed by law. There are actually 3 different 3-day rights of rescission that might apply for a homeowner's home improvement contract in New Jersey. You've got one on the federal level from the FTC. They've got a 3-day cooling off period. There's an older statute on door-to-door sales of home improvement that allows for 3 days right of rescission. And there's also in the Contractor Registration Act for home improvement contractors, obligating them to give you written notice of your right to unwind the deal, if you do what you're supposed to do by giving them notice within the 3 days.
Okay, so that right of rescission, and that really does offer some protection to the homeowners. They really can get out of their contract, so if they sign something and later regretted it, they can totally unwind it, like you said?
If you do it in the manner that the law prescribes, absolutely. One of the things that you keep in mind is that you're entitled to that 3-day right of rescission in writing. And if you don't get it, that's one of the things that'll trip up a home improvement contractor and obligate him for any kind of loss that might result later on in the law of consumer fraud. So they're obligated to give you the written notice. You should read the written notice. There are little things that you might not see in the written notice. So for example, if you get a written notice for the federal law, certain federal holidays are not counted in the 3 days, and state notices, it's the state holidays that apply.
Okay, good. Well, I'm sure in your line of work and with all your experience, you've probably seen a lot of interactions that have not gone great between contractors and homeowners. So what kind of things in your experience do you think homeowners should be doing for due diligence that a homeowner could perform when they're researching a contractor?
I would say you start with the Division of Consumer Affairs license lookup website. You go right onto the internet, put in the name of the contractor. Now, if it's a business, you look it up by the name of the business. If it's an individual who is doing home improvement without a limited liability company or a corporation, then you look up that individual's name, and you'll be able to tell immediately whether or not the individual or the company is registered to perform home improvement in New Jersey. If they're not registered and they're performing home improvement or they're selling home improvement, they're breaking the law, and you will wind up with a problem. Probably the contract certainly is going to be illegal, and there are certain problems that flow anytime you get involved with a home improvement contractor who's not registered. Chiefly, no municipal construction office will participate in issuing a permit for the work if it's presented to them as being performed by a home improvement contractor who's not registered. A home improvement contractor who's not registered will likely not have liability insurance because that might be difficult for them to obtain from a broker without a license, without a registration, I should say. Points for style. For contractors, it's registration. For electricians and other professional trades, they get licenses.
Wow, so you just mentioned a whole lot of things that people should be doing for due diligence, and a couple of them kind of stood out to me as red flags, like having a license. When you're trying to do your due diligence, there's a bunch of red flags in there, like having a license, making sure that you have a contract. Any other red flags that people should be looking out for when they're trying to hire a home improvement contractor?
Well, a home improvement contractor is going to be registered, or else don't do the deal. And one of the obligations that a home improvement contractor has to you under the contractor registration law and the regulations that are issued under it is to give you a certificate of insurance. when he talks to you about signing the contract and selling you the job. So you want to look at that certificate of insurance. It's a good idea to call up the insurance broker who issued the certificate to find out and make sure that the insurance is still in effect. Speaking of an insurance, you want to make sure that you understand that insurance does not insure shoddy workmanship, or insure against it, I should say. Shoddy workmanship is simply excluded from every contractor's liability policy unless the contractor causes some damage to your property or injures your person, God forbid, outside the scope of the contract work. That's excluded from the liability policy. So you keep in mind that you will get insurance coverage for damage, as in the case where a contractor backs into a fence. That's the kind of a thing that you would submit to his carrier. But if the work that's done is not up to snuff, or it's not finished, that's not an insurance claim.
Yeah, so there's a lot that homeowners need to be looking out for, and it's why it's really important to be dealing with a reputable contractor, because you need a contract, and like Bob was saying, you have to have specific things in that contract. You need to have your liability insurance so that if anything does happen on a job, they don't go against your homeowner's insurance to be filing a claim against that. You need to, have workers' comp and, all these various insurances and contracts. Man, there's a lot that has to go on. So that's why it's very important to do your due diligence and make sure that you're dealing with a reputable contractor that has all those things in place. And I guess, ultimately, even with good contractors or reputable ones, sometimes that problems do arise. And if a homeowner does have a problem that arises with their contractor, what kind of things can they do to try to resolve and solve those disputes?
Well, I'm a big fan of laws in New Jersey that allow you to agree in advance that for minor disagreements, such as whether a particular item in the contract has been finished to your satisfaction, you could flip it to a third party, neutral, somebody to come in and umpire and make the call. That's a good way to go. A lot of times you'll see that a contractor has in his contract or her contract an arbitration clause where you're not going to go immediately into court, but rather you would go and place this before someone who is hired to decide the dispute. I'm not a big fan of arbitration in home improvement. It tends to be very expensive, and you'll usually wind up bearing half of the cost. And you don't get all the protections that a lawsuit will give you in the way of being able to find out things that you need to know in order to prove your case. Also, it occurs to me that one of the things that you want to think about when you are signing a contract is whether or not you would be willing, in the interest of avoiding going to court, to give the contractor the right to come back in and make it right anytime you've got a problem. That's the law in many states, that a contractor has the right to re-enter the job and fix any problems before he or she is liable in court for the shortcoming. But you can put that in your contract, and the contractors are well served, I think, and people generally are well served by finding some resolution that doesn't involve a formal court setting or arbitration, or even making an umpire or having an umpire come in and make the call. One of the things that occurred to me, Bob, when you were speaking a minute ago, is that even though you're asking me these questions as a lawyer, and I could tell you chapter and verse on all these regs and statutes, there are things that the regulations and statutes don't have in them that a homeowner really ought to think about. Mostly, there's an opportunity for problems to arise when one party is significantly, we'll call it, ahead of the other. So that if there's more construction done than payments on account would equal, or if there's a lot less construction that's been done and a lot more money paid over in the beginning, sometimes people fail a character check, and contractor may abandon the work. The homeowner may find an excuse to fire the contractor without sufficient cause. It's a good idea when you put together a contract that you think carefully about the progress of the work and how much money you should be paying out as you go along, especially for a bigger job. For a bigger job, you need to think about whether or not the contract you've been presented with as a homeowner has been what's called front-end loaded, and all the money is being paid up front.
Right.
That's an invitation for trouble.
Right. Yeah, I've seen some places, some big box stores that required payments of 100% up front before they would even begin doing work. And to me, it almost seems like if you need the money up front, there's something that, why do you need all that up front? It's almost better to make smaller down payments and kind of pay as you go. What's your thinking on that?
Well, you have to remember, like I said in the beginning when we started speaking, people have different expectations on each side of the contract. All the homeowner has to do in order to perform in full under the agreement is to pay the money. But the contractor has to meet the expectations of the homeowner, and they may be all sorts of things that a contractor wouldn't ordinarily think of. And I think that brings us back to this idea of a worker-like job, to have implied into the agreement that the work only has to meet a workman-like standard. It does not have to constitute art. And the homeowner's expectations may be sometimes unnaturally high. Now, I'm not saying that you should put up with substandard workmanship, but you have to, in a more sophisticated understanding, realize that a contractor who you invited into your home to work, he may not see the work the same way that you as the homeowner see the work. And you've got to live in it every day, so don't put up with anything that isn't to your satisfaction. But keep in mind that that may not happen on the first pass. Again, let's go back to the idea of giving that contractor a chance to make it right. And then if he doesn't make it right, well, you come and see a guy like me, and the law is really very much on the side of the homeowner.
Right, and I can imagine that some homeowners could be leery of trying to give a contractor another chance to make it right if they weren't really happy with what was going on during the construction. So how much of that, really should a homeowner be willing to do to let that happen? I know you had mentioned that legally the contractor does have the obligation to make it right, but where is that? I guess there's some flexibility, or how does that work?
Well, I think the first thing that the homeowner ought to consider is that you can go hire a lawyer at $6 a minute. Along about the third or fourth bill, you're going to be examining that decision fairly closely. So that if you have a chance to hold somebody's feet to the fire until you get what you want without involving an attorney,
good point.
That's a fine way to go. And you know what? Amicable dispute resolution is good for everybody. As long as people can break the logjam and get on with their affairs, giving a little bit is a good idea.
And I guess by not paying everything up front, or not, like you mentioned, not you getting ahead with payments, but you retaining control by withholding some payments, that could be a lever that you could use to get them to complete the work to your satisfaction as well.
Well, of course it does, and that's really playing to the motivation of the contractor. The contractor wants a paycheck. You want a particular product. You want a job that you can look at, admire, show off to your friends and your family, feel good about, and it's your space. You live in it. But what you want to do is try to draw the fine distinction between whether or not you're happy with the work and whether or not you feel disrespected in your own home. That seems to drive an awful lot of litigation, that feeling that you've been disrespected. But it's not necessarily well-founded at all times. I mean, if a fella leaves the front door open and your prize Scotty runs out into traffic, it isn't that he means harm to you from the start. It's just a question of not being aware of things. So one of the things you might want to do is to sit and think about the areas in your home where you could find problems, so that if a contractor is going to be putting up new gutters, maybe take a minute and say, those are my prize rose bushes out there. Please
Right.
don't drag a ladder across, and raise his or her awareness as to what you're talking about. You know, you don't want your $1,000 angelfish to die from plaster that settles
Right.
down onto the top of the fish tank. You gotta think this through. And when you see red mud on your white rug, that's a covered claim. So you can always find some way to make things even.
Right. So I guess like you were mentioning, and communication is really the key. You have to set what your expectations are going to be for the contractor, as well as the reverse. The contractor's really got his expectations are going to be within the contract, but it's really important to make sure that you trust somebody and that you feel you can communicate them, because you're going to be dealing with them and these potential issues for weeks, if not months, in your home. So you really got to want somebody in your home that you feel comfortable with, that you can trust. And one thing that you had mentioned before, Bob, that I thought was pretty interesting was this idea of having an umpire. I'd really never heard of that before. Can you explain a little bit, like, what is an umpire and what would they do to help try to resolve a dispute?
Well, for about 2,000 years we had lawsuits, and litigation was the way that people resolved their problems. Arbitration came into vogue a couple of years back as a way of keeping the lid on costs in business disputes. And then there's also mediation, where you would have somebody come in and try to broker peace. In New Jersey, these kinds of alternative dispute resolution methods are very much in favor. And there is a particular law in New Jersey, the Alternative Dispute Resolution Act, I believe it's called, where you can engage a referee of sorts, where both sides can get together and they can appoint a third party to make calls concerning facts. Now, if you're talking about a home improvement contract that goes sideways, the law is always going to be the law, but the facts are what takes a lot of money, hiring experts to give opinions in court as to whether or not the homeowner got what he or she paid for. And those kinds of facts can be determined very readily by someone who's experienced in construction to come out in the field and take a look at the work in place and decide, whether or not that work meets the standard, or the materials, by the way, whether or not they're what was called for in the contract. And when you make that call, that's an opinion of fact. And you need an expert. And a homeowner can't go into court and give an opinion of fact concerning construction. A judge simply won't hear it on rules of evidence. A homeowner, unless he or she has a background in construction, is not competent to testify on that matter. So that you're always going to have a dispute resulting in an expert opinion as to whether or not the work met the standard for workmanship, and another opinion, what is the appropriate fix? And then in third opinion, as to what is the likely cost of the appropriate fix. Now, all these are issues that can be resolved by a third party neutral coming out and having a look at the work in place. I don't want to turn this into a seminar on alternative dispute resolution, but I mention it because litigation is expensive and it's time consuming and it takes a long time. You might want to think about what your alternatives are. You might want to explore them. But let me say this too, Bob.
Okay.
It all comes back down to the contract. What a contract does is it apportions risk on either side of the transaction. So that if you have those angelfish that are floating around in there and you're having drywall put it in the contract as to who's responsible for what. And put it into the contract if you will not allow certain things to happen on your property. You got to have these risks managed. The law will supply the missing elements almost all the time, but not in the particular.
Well, that was excellent stuff, Bob. I really appreciate you sharing that. And just to give everybody a heads up, Jay Cipriani, the owner of our business, has been called in to be an expert witness and give testimony in regards to these types of cases that Bob had brought up. So, you're dealing with somebody here who has over 40 years of experience that knows what construction should be, and we make sure that we do things to the letter of, not only to the letter of the law, but also with excellence in building, because we want to avoid all these things and give you the best possible project possible. So if you are thinking about doing a remodeling project, we'd love to be able to talk to you. You can always contact us at wecare@ciprianibuilders.com or give us a call. And we thank you for tuning in this time. We would love to be able to chat with you and talk to you the next time on Remodeling Reimagined. Thanks.
Once again, thanks for tuning in, everyone. And if you're looking to start a remodeling project, you can learn more about our design process at CiprianiRemodelingSolutions.com. And you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.